for the meeting, but I just want to highlight that he's a renowned conservation biologist and explorer, and he has started the ECOLIFE Conservation organization. Of course, he's going to be talking about the story of the monarch butterfly's amazing migration, and he has a background in California condor recovery programs, and he has traveled more than 100 countries and has specialized in rainforest transects and remote field conservation programs for the San Diego Zoo, which is so exciting, kind of a local guy. Anyway, he has left that and has now launched his new ECOLIFE Conservation. So I'm going to go ahead and let him get started with his program tonight. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Martha. Pleasure to be here tonight. Excuse me for just a second. I'm going to share my screen and pull up my slide presentation, and hopefully that will go smoothly and quickly. There we go. Now, hopefully everyone can see the screen. Let's see if I can make sure it's, whoops, that's not what I was supposed to do yet. There we go. So thank you very much for your introduction, Martha. Yes, my name is Bill Toone, and this story of the monarch butterfly is kind of funny. As Martha mentioned, my history is with the California Condor Recovery Program initially, and then field programs all over the world. But there was a day I was sitting in my office and I watched a woman walk by my office window, and I thought she was about the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And to make a very long story short, she was more interested in butterflies than she was in me. And so I decided I was going to learn about butterflies. And tomorrow we celebrate her birthday, and we've been married for more than 30 years. But she's the reason I got into the monarch butterfly studies and programs. So with that, we'll launch into it. She's already given a little bit of bio about myself. So I'll skip over this little shot, and we'll start with the story of the monarch butterfly. And one of the really remarkable things about insects is that they really define for us their link to plants and the whole network of life that we know around us. In the case of the monarch butterfly, they're an obligate host to the milkweed plant, plants in the genus Asclepia. They have to have milkweed to lay their eggs on. It's the only thing that their larvae will eat. And so one of the attributes of milkweed is that it has in it a cardioglycoside, a poison. And when the caterpillars feed on this milkweed, they actually can sequester this poison, and it's passed on to the adult butterflies, making them poisonous to anything that eats them. And it explains the bright black and red coloration of the monarch. These are all warning colors that I'm poisonous and don't eat me, but it all goes back to this host plant, the milkweed. And although most of our discussion today is going to be on eastern monarchs, towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk again about milkweed, because I know we all live here in San Diego and want to know what we can do for our local monarchs as well. But in any event, monarch butterflies can sense chemical signals from milkweed at distances of more than 3 miles. They will track that milkweed down. They have an interesting behavior where not only can they find milkweed, but we refer to this as self-medication. They can actually detect milkweed species that have higher poison levels than others. And this will become important later in our talk. If you have several varieties of milkweed around, you'll notice very quickly that they only go to one of them, and that will be the one with the highest level of toxins in it. But this is a photograph of a female laying her egg on the apical tip of a milkweed. And that egg is about the size of the head of a pin. It'll be there for just a few days. The embryo will develop very quickly within. It's quite translucent, and you can quickly see the black head capsule of the baby caterpillar forming. Now, unlike birds that break out of their shells, caterpillars do what they do best. They eat their way out. A caterpillar really, from a biological standpoint, is a head, a gut, and an anus. And all they do is eat. That is their job. So they will eat their way out of the egg. This little guy, once he finishes getting out of the egg, one of the first things he'll do is turn around and finish eating the eggshell. And they're very tiny at this point, and when they start eating on the Asclepia, they can only scrape off that first layer of cells, but very rapidly they will grow in size. They go through 5 instars, or 5 developmental phases as a caterpillar. Being insects, each time they go through a phase, they have to shed their skin to get bigger. So they will shed their skin 5 times, and during this period of time, they will increase their body weight by thousands of folds. So from that very tiny larva, in 5 molts of its skin, it will become quite a significant caterpillar. Now this caterpillar, and this is a note for all of you who want to rescue butterflies and caterpillars, when you see a caterpillar wandering across your sidewalk or down the street, that's an adult a mature caterpillar, not an adult, but they are in what they call the wandering phase. When they are in their 5th instar, they don't eat anymore and they wander. They leave their host plant because predators know they are there, and they're preparing for one of the most dangerous parts of their life, and that's when they are a chrysalis, where they cannot escape from predators by running or having any behavioral changes. So they look for a quiet spot away from their host plant to form a chrysalis. The word chrysalis is from the Greek, and it refers to valuable ores. And almost every chrysalis in every species will have spots of either gold, silver, or maybe even both on them. But no matter how ornamental, I've always thought that the monarch butterfly's chrysalis is amongst the most beautiful in the world. They really are quite special. And it's a bit of magic that happens inside of that chrysalis over the next 10 to 14 days. This videography was done by Lynn Splain in the ECOLIFE Conservation offices, and she's really done a beautiful job of capturing the story of the monarch butterfly. So now we've taken you through their whole life cycle, from egg to larva to the chrysalis, and now to the adult monarch butterfly, or imago. But one of the things that makes the monarch butterfly so fascinating is the fact that this miraculous story doesn't end here, and in fact only becomes more miraculous at this point. This is the world's only migratory insect. And before I get too much into their migration, and I am going to describe the migration of the eastern monarch, because that is the epic migration of the monarchs. There's several races of monarch butterflies in the US. They all have, there's about 5 different populations. They all have quite different behaviors and certainly some commonalities. But this migratory behavior of the eastern monarch is quite spectacular. And the story really goes back to these 2 folks. Gosh, his name's going to escape me for just a moment here, and it'll come to me very quickly. He was a Canadian biologist, an entomologist, and as a small child, he enjoyed watching the monarch butterflies in Canada, playing in the fields during the summer. And he would follow them around in the fields as a child and chase them as they started to leave in the late summer, early fall. They would head for the border of the United States, and it was there that he would lose them. And I'm sorry, it's Fred Urquhart. And Fred was fascinated, excuse me while I mute my phone. Fred was fascinated by these butterflies and the fact that they disappeared in the fall and came back every year. And he decided he wanted to learn where all the monarch butterflies were going. He went on to school. He ultimately got a PhD in entomology, and he dedicated, along with his wife, Nora, 40 years of his life to trying to determine where the monarch butterflies went. He realized very early on that if he was ever going to find out where they went, he needed a way to be able to track the monarch butterfly. And this is an old picture. This is when my wife and I, Sunny, first started tagging monarch butterflies 32 years ago. They've changed the technique a little bit over the years, but not too much. The story hangs true here. You clear a window on the wing of the butterfly. So butterfly wings are covered with very tiny scales. These scales are to help them escape from predators. They're meant to fall off of their wings. And you can actually estimate the age of a butterfly by the condition of their wings and how many scales they've lost just through flying and all these other things. But if you stick a tag, and you can see on my finger a little bit of a sticky tag right at the end of the frame, if you stick anything with glue onto that wing while the scales are there, it'll fall off. So we rub the scales off, create this little clear window, and then the tag is pinched over the edge of the wing and onto that window. Now they use a little round tag that isn't pinched over the edge, that goes on the hind wing instead, but it's a very similar process. But what you have to hope for then is that someone finds a dead butterfly, number one, which is hard to do. You don't see a lot of dead butterflies. They don't last long. And they are not only that, but they have to find a dead butterfly with your tag out of a population of billions of butterflies. So Fred knew right away he was going to need a lot of help. And he got out in the 50s and 60s. He went to every hippie commune in North America. He went to Rotary clubs. He went to every community group, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and taught people how to tag butterflies and collect data to try and increase the odds, the infinitesimal odds of having a butterfly returned to him, so that he could determine where the butterfly had been tagged and where it had been found and help to track their journey. Over many, many years, this led him to the US-Mexican border. And it was there that his hunt began to run cold, and Fred was aging out. He had a pretty serious heart problem. His doctors were encouraging him to quit. And this is when, like behind all great men, there's a great wife. And this is when Nora stepped in and really saved the day for him. She said, Fred, you're never going to figure this out on your own. Let me help. She did a radio story that was aired in Mexico City. It was heard by a guy down there who was helping them set up the technology to sew underwear. But this man had fallen in love with a Purépecha woman who had told him stories about monarch butterflies coming back every year to her village in astronomical numbers. And he always just took it as a little fairy tale that this indigenous woman would tell him. But when he heard Nora's story about this search for the monarch butterfly, he contacted the Urquharts and told them about it. And Fred finally was able to go down there. Now, the butterflies that he was going to be taken to were at altitudes of 10 to 11,000 feet. And his doctors encouraged him not to go. And in fact, Fred struggled mightily getting up the mountain. And when he got to where the butterflies were, and the story I'm telling you is quite true, it was documented by a National Geographic photographer who traveled with him and described what happened. And this is just in the early 70s, so not all that long ago for some of us. Fred was exhausted. He got there. He had never seen such a spectacle of butterflies in his life. And though he didn't have time to do the math quickly, I can tell you right now that what he was looking at was about 800 tons of monarch butterflies in the trees, over 1 billion individual butterflies, where when they set flight into the air, the only thing that you could hear was the roar of their wings. It sounded like pouring rain. But Fred was a dynamic biologist who wouldn't just the fact that there were a lot of butterflies there didn't mean anything to him. He needed to know that these were his butterflies. And he sat down on a stump, and with his walking stick, he stirred a pile of dead butterflies at his feet. And lo and behold, a butterfly with a tag on it turned up. And he knew that he had found the overwintering home of the eastern North American population of the monarch butterfly. This story then made the cover a year or two later of National Geographic. The woman pictured here is the indigenous Purepecha woman who told her boyfriend at the time the stories of the butterflies coming back. So the butterflies arrive in Mexico on Day of the Dead. And for the Purepecha people in the mountains of Michoacan, on Day of the Dead, they believe that these butterflies are the spirits of their lost children and loved ones coming back for their annual visit. So it's a moment of religious significance in their communities and very, very important. And they arrive in small numbers at first, and then increasing numbers landing on the vegetation and beginning to fill the trees. And over a very short period of time at the end of October and early November, over these Day of the Dead holidays, literally, as I said, hundreds of tons of butterflies arrive in their communities. They head to the Oyamel fir forest, these high mountain forests at 10,000, 11,000 feet. It's the transvolcanic range separating the state of Michoacan from the district of Mexico City. These forests are an ancient Oyamel fir forest that is an enormous watershed that's provided water to one of the world's largest cities for time immemorial, and many other industrial communities around it. The relationship with these Oyamel fir trees is very intimate. These Oyamel firs have stood all summer in the sun. As winter comes on, the butterflies come and form a blanket on them. And it's a very symbiotic relationship as the butterflies share the stored heat from the trees to help them survive through the winter. And at the same time, the blanket the butterflies form on the tree helps to insulate the tree as well. And when they get very cold, the butterflies will shiver. A fascinating thing to stand in a forest where you can hear the shivering of hundreds of millions of butterflies as they generate body heat to stay alive. Come spring, they take flight in huge numbers, absolutely enormous numbers, going out to find liquids. They look for water and for nectar to restore themselves after about 2 to 3 months of very frigid cold in these high mountains. These floods of butterflies are called a drop, and it's as though one butterfly is connected to another, and when one leaves, millions leave all at the same time, and they go out, they get water and nectar, and then they fly back to the trees for the night, waiting for spring solstice to begin their journey north. Now, one of the things I haven't mentioned is that this migration is an annual round trip, but it takes 4 generations to complete. This generation that spends the winter in Mexico is called the Methuselah generation. And they're called that because they live much longer than all of the other generations. And one of the ways they survive is by not expending energy on reproduction. Instead, they don't reproduce, they become sexually senescent. They put all that energy into flying and surviving the winter. Come springtime, the butterfly's hormones come alive and they want to breed. And that act of pursuing females and laying eggs will lead to the death of this generation. The next 3 generations will only live 4 to 6 weeks because their job is to reproduce and redistribute the population across North America. So as they fly north, they're breeding and laying eggs until this whole wave of butterflies returns all the way back up to Canada and begins the migration again. Unfortunately, these Oyamel fir forests are in trouble, and it's an important part of the story. And there are, as I told you, butterflies weren't my first interest. And this was a transition I made out of love to start to study the butterflies. And simultaneously, this passion for butterflies, I also ended up getting an assignment in Madagascar. So very quickly, I'm going to take you to Madagascar because it ends up affecting how I looked at monarch butterflies. Then we'll come back to our monarch butterflies, finish that story, and we'll call it a night after that. But I was given an opportunity to do a biological transect across the Maswal Peninsula in Madagascar. This was a huge opportunity for a biologist. Madagascar has a very high level of endemism. These are animals found nowhere else on Earth. Entire families of primates like the lemurs that you can find nowhere else on the planet. This biological transect that I would lead would cover about 100 miles. We would cross in as straight a line as we could the pristine forests of the Maswal Peninsula in the northeastern tropical portion of the country. It turned out to be quite a spectacular and strenuous trek. Beautiful scenery and lots of wildlife, some rough living. Each of the blue tarps, one blue tarp is for a kitchen. The other blue tarp was where I could work and organize my specimens and keep notes. And the yellow tents were where we would spend the night. I was traveling with a National Geographic photographer, myself, and then a handful of porters to help me and the photographer move our equipment across the peninsula. The photographer I was traveling with is a guy named Roy Toft, and he and I both became very ill on the trip. And by the time we reached the other side of the peninsula, we really needed medical attention. We'd come down with some pretty serious staph infections. And we stumbled through a little village called Antanambao. And the people of Antanambao fled into the forest. They were afraid of the white people who came. And Roy and I were just as content because we weren't ready to talk to anyone. We really needed to get to the end of our journey and get some help. And so Antanambao just became a footnote in my records, a footnote that became very important. And a year later, I was asked actually by the Malagasy government to go live in Madagascar to help the community there, this little village we had found, become accustomed to what might happen if because they had decided to turn this area of rainforest into a national park. I'm going to work through the story very quickly, but the bottom line is this, is that the people were terrified of my wife and I. We were unable to establish any kind of communication with them. And after about 2 weeks, we gave up and began to pack our bags to leave. And it was then that an 18-month-old little boy, this is a picture of him a year or two later, hid in the bushes near our camp and was watching us break camp. And I said, Sonny, let's wait. We'll see how this goes. And I put my hand behind my back and counted for him, until finally I heard him talking back. And Emilian, Sonny, and I became very, very dear friends. And eventually other kids came to our camp. Then their moms came to see where their kids were going. And finally, one day they moved our camp into the village, and we were able to start with training sessions and classes. But needless to say, this little boy became very dear to us. And we worked in Madagascar from 1995 until November of 1999, when we had to leave. And by the time we left, we had made so many very dear friends. Leaving was very hard and very emotional. And hardest of all, of course, was saying goodbye now to little Emilian. And this is a picture of the last day that we saw him. We were leaving the village and his mom and dad intercepted us and gave us their son. They wanted us to take Emilian home with us and offer him a better life. We couldn't do that, and for a lot of reasons. And all we really could do at that moment was turn around and walk away. And it was one of the most difficult things that my wife and I have ever had to do. Compounded by the fact that as soon as we got home, we ended up in Mexico for the spring migration of the monarchs. And there was a storm that in one night killed 70% of the North American population of monarch butterflies in one 24-hour period. So emotionally drained after leaving Emilian, we were crushed by this enormous die-off of butterflies, what seemed to be something that we could never recover from. And it was only 2 months after that that we received word of an enormous cyclone forming in the Indian Ocean basin and aimed directly for the Maswa Peninsula in Madagascar, where we had worked and where we had left Emilion. This cyclone set land right at Antanambao. And the only thing we knew is that it was a record-breaking cyclone that had wiped out every home within 100 miles. And bear in mind, again, our village was thatched huts in the middle of all of that. And hundreds of people died. All of this one on top of the other really impacted us badly. And we had gone to conservation groups asking for help to go back and search for Emilion and his family. At the same time, we were looking for funding to help things in Mexico. But when it came to Madagascar, the story was, no, we only do animals. This money is for conservation and it's about animals and not people. Sunny and I searched for Emilion twice on our own, eventually ran out of money and could not find him. And so it impacted the way I looked at the forests in Madagascar. Or in Mexico, I was crushed by the losses. I was crushed by the attitude of the conservation community when it came to people. And here I had to deal with this enormous die-off in butterflies. And it took some time to kind of resolve what was going on. But in reality, what had happened to the butterflies is that as trees were being cut out of the forest so that people could cook their food and keep their children warm at night, they were thinning the forest in the same way that you would punch holes in a blanket. And sooner or later, you have enough holes in your blanket and it doesn't keep you warm anymore. And that's exactly what was happening in the forests in Mexico. The needs of people were causing them to thin the forest, to thin the blanket that had been protecting the monarch butterflies. And without that protective blanket, the cold winter storms was going to drive the migrating population to extinction. The interesting thing about a lot of the cutting is that they're not cutting the wood for lumber or trees, as I mentioned. We call it the workshop of the ants, the taller de hormigas, where thousands of people are going into the forest every day, collecting the wood that they need to cook and stay warm. Those thousands of people multiplied day after day have a tremendous impact on the monarch butterfly reserves, removing about 250,000 trees a year, one stick at a time. Every yard in the Purepecha and Masawa communities in the mountains around the reserves are stacked with the lumber and firewood that they need, and that also the monarch butterfly needs. So we took a closer look at all this, and the wood that they're cutting is going into what we call a 3-stone fire. And this is really important. We live on a planet of somewhat over 7 billion people. Of those 7 billion people, the World Health Organization estimates that 3.2 billion of them still cook over 3 stones on the floor of their kitchen in their homes. Those 3 billion people are harvesting wood from the forest and burning it in a terribly inefficient manner, which is a huge threat to our forests and to climate change. Equally, though, the smoke in these homes from these unvented cooking fires is a critical killer of people. World Health Organization also estimates that more than 4.2 million people die every year from the effects of indoor cooking smoke, mostly women and children. This is the life of people living in these rural communities. This is happening all over the world. Those 4.3 million people, if you take AIDS, breast cancer, dirty drinking water, and malaria, and add the deaths from all of those things together, it still doesn't equal the number of people dying from indoor cooking smoke. So we took a whole new approach to doing conservation, and instead of protecting forests directly and putting fences around things and telling people they couldn't go there, I left my 35-year career with the zoo. I started an organization called ECOLIFE Conservation, with the idea being that we would never leave people behind in our conservation efforts. In Mexico now, we've just completed our 7,000th stove. Each stove that we build saves 17 trees every year. because it uses less fuel. It still uses wood, but it uses 50% less wood than they were using before. Every stove is equipped with a chimney to take smoke out of their homes. And because of the efficiency of the fire, there's less black carbon, which means less climate change. You can see the ceiling of this house, the load of carbon and tar on the ceiling. This is what was in their lungs prior to a stove like this going in. So here was an opportunity where conservation could have a direct and immediately measurable benefit to people and to their health, and a direct and measurable contribution to the conservation of trees, forests, and in the end, the monarch butterflies. So we continue that work in the hopes of protecting both the butterflies and the next generation of humans. And the work we do there in terms of its climate impact is international. The health impact is immediate and local and profound. And we're very proud of it, and that there will be a generation of children who are healthier and safer. And the other side effect to this is that, and this is, we build stoves also in Uganda now where the mountain gorillas live. And when a sick kid goes to the doctor in Uganda, and their eyes are running and their nose is running and they're coughing and they can't go to school, the prescription handed out by the doctor is an ECOLIFE stove. Because by putting the stove in, we get rid of all these respiratory ailments that these children are dealing with. What it means is that these kids spend more time in school. And what we know is that educated women and empowered women have smaller families. And we all know that the human population is really the biggest threat to ourselves. We have to find a way to manage that. By getting kids into school and better educated, healthier, we believe that we can make a big contribution to our future. And I have to tell you that we did this work for 16 years, always carrying the love that we had for this little boy in Madagascar. We started ECOLIFE not to go back to Madagascar and save a million. That day had passed. But instead to perform good works that would make it safer for other children and wildlife around the world. For those of us here in San Diego, we have a challenge for the monarch butterfly. We want to do all that we can to help, and I encourage you to plant milkweed. The most common milkweed that people plant in their garden is this one. This is the tropical milkweed. It's easily available in nurseries now because everyone knows that we love butterflies, so they've started producing it. Sadly, be very, very careful when you go to a nursery and you're looking at tropical milkweed and thinking about buying it. Look for caterpillars on it. If there's no caterpillars on it, don't buy it because they systemically treat it with a pesticide, so it'll look really good for the nurseries. And then you bring it home and it kills all of your butterflies. So look for plants that are less than perfect and have caterpillars on them. Better yet, you can go to a website of a fellow organization that we collaborate with a lot, xerces.org, XERCES.org, and put in where you live, and they'll tell you about your own native milkweeds. This is a slender leaf, narrow leaf milkweed, which is native here in San Diego, as well as this Indian milkweed. They do very well here. They are supposed to be here, unlike the tropical milkweed, which is an import. What we find though is, as I mentioned earlier, the tropical milkweed carries a heavier poison load in it than our local milkweeds. So if you have tropical milkweed, they won't use your natives. And our tropical milkweed is a bit of a problem because it doesn't die back in our winters, and it prevents the migration of our Western population of monarch butterflies. Our Western population has a migration, not as spectacular as the Mexican migration, but important nonetheless. And when the milkweeds don't die back, it anchors the butterflies in place and disrupts the migration. So I won't tell you not to plant tropical milkweed because there's a lot of it around, but I will tell you that by the 1st of November, please cut it back to the ground and keep it cut back to the ground until springtime, when it will come back and feed another generation of butterflies. And as I wrap up, I want to tell you that after 16 years of doing this work, 3 of our larger donors at ECOLIFE came to me and said, it's time for you to go back to Madagascar and find out the real end to your story. And in 2016, extraordinarily well-funded, we went back to Madagascar And I'm happy to tell you, I found our little boy after all that time. And it was a wonderful reunion, and it's a story for another day. And I hope you'll invite me back to share more stories about our work. We're very proud of it. And I'm really proud of having the opportunity to talk to you all tonight. And I thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was very, very interesting and, you know, heartwarming. So thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions for Bill now? We can go ahead and you can type them in or in the chat. Would be the best if anyone has questions. And I see we did post the, I don't know how you pronounce it, xeris.org.
Did you watch that?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct. That's
Hold on.
Xerxes'
I just saw the most amazing thing. I'll tell you how you can see it some other time on the migration of butterflies. Henry, where are you?
Oh,
Henry?
Judith went to look for something. Does anyone want to type in any questions or comments or? No. I didn't know about the different milkweeds. I see, like you say, in the nurseries, there are all those tropicals, and I've planted them in the past. So are the ones that you showed us, the local ones, are they available in nurseries at all? Do you know?
No, as to the best of my knowledge, most of our nurseries do not offer the local ones. There's a nursery here in Escondido, North County, called Las Palitas, and sometimes I've known them to have them. But if you go onto Xerxes' website, they will tell you who will sell seeds for our local milkweeds, for the Indian and narrowleaf milkweed.
Oh, wonderful.
And you can get the seeds, and they germinate very easily and do quite well.
Okay. And I do see someone says they did get a narrow leaf at City Farmers once.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
you don't see
someone
them very
from the East Coast sent their cousins some seeds. So so it is around, I guess.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the question here is, did the butterfly population come back after that horrible storm?
It came back in part. So 32 years ago, so I've gone to see the butterfly migration in Mexico every year now for 32 years, always in February. And this February coming will be the first year in 32 years that we won't go because of COVID. In that period of time, we have seen the monarch butterfly overwintering population decline by 90%.
Oh, wow.
So there's only 10% of the butterflies there. Now, that said, to go down there and see a couple 100 million butterflies is still quite spectacular, and worth doing. So it's been very tough, and their problems are not only in Mexico, unfortunately. You know, with a migration like this, they're traveling across the breadbasket of the United States, through all of our huge agricultural communities where there's an enormous use of pesticides or GMO crops that impact them. And so their journey has become much, much more complicated, which is what makes it all the more important that we plant milkweed in our yards and do all that we can to support them.
Yeah, maybe we'll get our local nurseries here to get some in stock for us.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Lynn.
It's on propagation of the milkweed, and it's a twofold question. I heard you say that now that the monarchs have migrated, because I haven't seen many butterflies, and my milkweed is all ragged and eaten up, and it's producing seeds. One, is it the time now to take all those seeds and put them in the ground? Because I have put them in the ground and I propagate them. They're now about, like 1/8 of an inch high. Is that good to do? And also, when you cut them back, do those die, or do they start in spring producing new foliage and growing?
Yeah. So I'll go backwards. When you cut them back, no, they don't die. They will come back up in the springtime. In fact,
So it's good to prune them then.
Yeah, they're very persistent. You may find that you'll have to cut them back several times in the course of the fall and winter, because you want to keep them cut back at least until the end of February. And so for your seeds, I would say the same thing. Collect the seeds and refrigerate or store them, and wait until the spring to plant them, because even when they're tiny, they will act as an attractant to the butterflies and anchor them down. So so the idea is to have as little milkweed available as possible.
Okay, so I better go out there and collect all those puff things that are around in the seed pods.
Yeah, just collect those and hang on to them. A lot of people talk about this parasite. It goes by the initials OE, which is can be on milkweed. So with our local milkweeds, what happens is they die. Our local ones die back on their own every winter, and this reduces parasite loads. When you leave tropical milkweed all year round, it maintains those parasite loads, and they get magnified over time and become a threat to the butterflies. So it's not just allowing them to migrate, but it's a health issue for the butterflies as well, to be sure that those are cut.
And I have two other questions. I'll be brief. One, what do you recommend for getting rid of those yellow aphids that are on the plant? And two, I have an African milkweed. Have you ever seen one of those? It's a big bush, and it's also called a swan plant, and it gets seed pods about this big. And I have it as a plant, and the monarchs loved it, and there were larvae on it all summer. Is that detrimental to the environment here to have it? I guess I have a tropical one, or I'm not even sure what milkweed I have, if I have like an African milkweed or the swan plant.
Any milkweed that stays green through our winter is not great for the butterflies. So any milkweed that's still green in the winter should be cut back.
Okay.
And even the swan plant, I believe, will do just what the tropical does and come back from rootstock.
Yeah, because it's still really big. It's like a bush.
Yeah, and you don't, once you cut them back to the ground, you don't need to water them or care for them until springtime again. They're very persistent.
Okay, and then the aphids, since I didn't cut them back, they're still flowering, and I find these aphids that sort of like are rhythmic in their movements.
Yeah, you'll find two things that love milkweed besides monarch butterflies, and one of them is aphids, the other is a milkweed beetle. And the milkweed beetle is actually harmless to everyone. It's a friend. You should leave them alone. It's a red and black beetle. You'll see them quite frequently on milkweed. The aphids are another issue. They really, especially on the tropical milkweed, they really load it up and can really debilitate the plant. But you don't want to use a pesticide on them, obviously, because it'll impact the butterflies as well. I usually go out and either just squish, take the whole top and keep squishing them with my fingers, or use soapy water on them to get rid of them. But you don't want to use any chemical treatments, or you're going to treat butterflies as well. And yes, you can use, butterflies but not butterflies, ladybugs and ladybug larvae who feed on aphids. A lot of times the milkweed gets so heavily loaded with them that the ladybugs can't knock it all back, but they certainly do help, and they're an organic and safe way to go.
Well, thank you.
I have a
Does
question.
anyone have any other questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Where does the western monarch migrate?
Yeah, the western monarch has an interesting migration that really messed us up, because we understood the western migration long before we learned anything about the eastern migration, because we were all here and it migrated locally. So whereas the eastern population does this amazing north-south migration, the western monarch does an east and west migration. So our butterflies are supposed to leave San Diego this time of year, or leave the mountains this time of year and come into the coastal areas. You can go to places like Pacific Grove. You used to be able to go to Balboa Park or Old Town or UCSD and some parts of northern Baja California, and see huge overwintering colonies of the western monarchs from about November through February. Most of those colonies have been wiped out by development. At UCSD, I'm an alumni of UCSD, and I'm sorry to say that they built the biology library on top of the last population of overwintering monarchs. So now you can read about it, but you can't see it. And there's a couple of overwintering sites that still occur in Old Town. I don't know if there's any still coming into Balboa Park, but you can go to Pacific Grove. To give you an idea though, the Pacific Grove overwintering population might be between 1,000 and 10,000 butterflies by comparison to hundreds of millions. So it's much less, but anyway, they spend the winter here, and then come spring, they start migrating back up to the east and spread up into the mountains to the edge of the Rocky Mountains, and then return back to the West Coast come the fall. None of these things are black and white. And this is one of the really fascinating, confusing things about monarch butterflies. There's 3 populations in North America that don't migrate at all. The major population does north-south, another minor population does east and west, and they mix. And we don't know how it all stays sorted out.
I want to make a comment. Several years ago, we were up in the Pismo Beach area, and there's a little grove of trees, and monarchs were resting there, and it was Thanksgiving time. It was spectacular because you see pictures in books. That's exactly the way this looked. It was wonderful. But it was up around Pismo Beach.
Yeah.
I have a question. I've had lots and lots of butterflies all summer. They were just everywhere. And I have milkweed that I got the seeds from a covered with caterpillars plant from my neighbor across the canyon. And it has propagated to where it's invasive. And I have it everywhere. But the butterflies, they come and they look at it and they sit there and they look at it and then they go do something else, and nobody's laid any eggs. And it's the red and yellow stuff.
That it probably has to do with the type of milkweed that it is and the level of cardioglycoside in it. As long as there's milkweed plants with higher toxin levels, somewhere within a 3-mile range, they'll go to those and ignore the stuff with the lower levels.
So they're just going to my girlfriend's and they don't like mine. And I got her seeds. So that makes me mad.
Yeah,
So
they will they'll vary in their ability to produce that poison, and the butterflies can sense it. And like I say, they self-medicate. So they will search for that poison and the plants that have the highest levels. And if you happen to have some plants that don't produce that poison very well, then they just ignore them.
Oh, well. I see there's another little question there that's interesting. I don't know. Did you see that, Bill? Is it okay to supplement the milkweed with butternut squash?
I don't know. Probably not. And the reason, I mean, the caterpillars, they've really evolved around milkweed. And I have heard stories about the larvae eating something other than milkweed, but those are very anecdotal. It certainly, they're not going to get any toxin from which they need to help protect the population from butternut squash or anything like that. So even if they would eat it, it's actually not good. It wouldn't be good for the overall population in terms of what it does. So my short answer would be no.
So I asked that question because someone had suggested that to me. One day I went out and I had 18 caterpillars on one plant, and I rushed to the store and bought 2 more plants, and they completely stripped those. And then I was desperate and someone suggested butternut squash. And in fact, I put a slice of butternut squash at the base of the plant, and there were no more leaves left. They all came down and completely chowed down on it. So they definitely eat it. But I hear you that oops, what happened?
I don't know. I'm
okay.
Still here,
but I hear you that it doesn't have the toxin that they need.
Right.
So, but believe me, they eat butternut squash.
That's
good.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've heard stories like that, so that's interesting to hear it firsthand.
I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
And I apologize, I had to be late to the meeting, so I'm sorry if this is repeating. The last few years, I've only had tropical milkweed. And this year, I also got the narrow leaf milkweed, should I get rid of all the tropical milkweed? And my second question is narrowleaf milkweed never flowered. Is that typical?
Right.
So, yeah, those are great questions. And I wish I was more of a gardener like you all are to have better answers for you. But the tropical milkweed is, I mean, let's face it, it's an invasive pest that does really, really well. And there's hardly anything you can knock it back. Anytime you try to bring native plants into a garden, especially a garden that's cared for, and by that I mean not all of us xeriscape everything. So narrowleaf milkweed is not going to do well with additional water. It's got to be stressed. It's got to kind of go through our systems of life, and it might take a year or two before it gets to a point where it's enough to, sorry about my phone. Got it. So it'll take a while before it gets to a point that it'll flower and carry on. As to whether or not you should get rid of your tropical milkweed, this is always such a very difficult question, because if you get rid of your tropical milkweed, but you have a neighbor within 3 miles of your house that still has it, the butterflies are all going to go over there and you're not going to get it. So you may as well keep your tropical milkweed and just be religiously good about cutting it back every winter.
Okay, and then the narrowleaf, is it better in the ground or in pots? Because I put it in pots because it's easier for me to keep track of how much moisture it has.
Yeah, you know, again, narrowleaf being native, my inclination would be to say I'd put it in the ground because I'm really good at neglecting stuff. So my ground gets very dry, and that's really what once it's established, that's what it needs. Is it really needs to be neglected.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
This was lovely.
Yeah. Oh yeah. This has just been a pleasure to listen to and learn from. Thank you so much, Bill.
A pleasure. I have a bunch more stories, so I hope someday you'll invite me back.
Well, I was just going to say, I hope we do have you back and you can do another program for us. So we'll be in touch.
All right. Have a lovely evening. Thank you for sharing it with me.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. And we'll be talking.
All righty.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bill. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Oh, I just wanted to say to everybody, sorry, there's no meeting for December. That's our month off at the end of the year, but come back in January. We're going to have a super duper arborist who's going to show us how to keep your trees healthy and good looking. So coming up in January. So have a good holiday and New Year, and we'll see you then.
Happy holidays to everyone.
Yes.
Happy holidays.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Or no holiday
Be
party.
safe, stay healthy, be COVID free.
Oh,
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, come on.